Picture a tomb sealed in darkness, not the ornate sarcophagi of ancient terror, gilded and revered, but a mechanical coffin suspended in the void of oblivion. Inside, a consciousness flickers between existence and non-existence, trapped in a sleep that spans millennia. This is not death, though death would be kinder. This is the fate of the Dreadnought, the walking war machine that contains what remains of a space marine hero too valuable to die, too broken to truly live. Now imagine that tomb cracking open after 3,572 years of silence. But the hands that pry it open do not belong to tech priests whispering binary prayers, nor to battle brothers seeking their ancients' wisdom. They belong to Orks, green-skinned, fungal warriors who see the galaxy through eyes that perceive everything as either a weapon, a fight, or something to loot. This is not a story of honor. This is not a tale of glorious awakening. This is the collision of two of the Imperium's greatest nightmares: the deterioration of irreplaceable technology and the relentless, chaotic ingenuity of the greenskin menace. What happens when unstoppable scavengers meet an immovable object of ancient war? The answer is as horrifying as it is darkly fascinating. The nature of the ancient sleeper. To understand the magnitude of what the Orks have found, we must first comprehend what a dreadnought truly is. The Imperium speaks of them as honored ancients, walking testaments to duty that transcends death itself. Tech priests venerate them as sacred unions of flesh and machine. Battle brothers bow their heads in respect when these towering engines of war stride past. But beneath all that reverence lies a truth that even the most faithful struggle to accept. Dreadnoughts are tombs for the living, prisons disguised as salvation. A space marine becomes a dreadnought when his body is destroyed beyond even the considerable abilities of the chapter's apothecaries to repair. Limbs torn away, organs ruptured, spine shattered, the warrior lies on the edge of death, with only his augmented physiology keeping some spark of life flickering in his ruined form. In any other army, in any other circumstance, he would be granted the Emperor's peace, a bolt to the brain to end his suffering with honor. But Space Marines are not like other soldiers. Each one represents centuries of genetic manipulation, decades of training, generations of accumulated combat experience and tactical knowledge. To lose such a warrior is to lose an irreplaceable asset. And so the chapter makes what they call a merciful decision. The Marine's broken body is extracted from his power armor, what little remains of his organic form preserved in a sarcophagus filled with amniotic fluids. Neural interfaces are drilled directly into his spine and brain, connecting what remains of his consciousness to the Dreadnought systems. His arms become weapons, his legs become hydraulic pistons, his body becomes ceramite and adamantium, standing 3 to 6 meters tall depending on the pattern, bristling with enough firepower to level a building. They tell him it is an honor. They tell him his service continues. They do not tell him that he will spend the vast majority of his remaining existence in darkness and silence, suspended in a sleep that is haunted by nightmares he cannot wake from. They do not mention that each time he awakens, he will remember less of who he was, his personality slowly eroding like stone beneath a relentless tide. They certainly never speak of the madness that claims so many dreadnought pilots, their minds unable to cope with the centuries of isolation and the horror of existing as a consciousness trapped in a machine. The sleep is necessary. Extended neural interface with a vehicle as massive and complex as a dreadnought creates immense mental stress, lethargy, confusion, dyschronometria, the inability to properly perceive the passage of time, and so, eventually, senility. These are not possibilities but inevitabilities for a dreadnought pilot who remains conscious too long. The organic portions of their brains, despite being enhanced far beyond baseline human capability, simply cannot sustain the strain of continuous operation. the amniotic fluids that preserve what remains of their flesh begin to break down. The neural connections start to degrade. Pain, which their augmented bodies were designed to ignore, becomes a constant shriek that even gene-forged nerves cannot entirely block. So they sleep. Between battles, between campaigns, sometimes for decades or even centuries, the dreadnoughts are sealed in stasis vaults deep within their chapter's fortress monastery. Their life support systems cycle down to minimal power. Their consciousness drifts into something that is neither true sleep nor true wakefulness, a liminal state where dreams and memories blur into incomprehensible fragments. Some report visions of battles that happened centuries ago. Others experience the sensation of fighting wars that have yet to occur. Many simply exist in a void so complete that when they are finally awakened, they wonder if they ever truly existed at all. The oldest known dreadnought still in service is Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, who walked beside the Primarch Leman Russ during the Great Crusade and fought in the Horus Heresy itself. He has been entombed for over 10,000 years, awakened perhaps once every millennium for the most dire circumstances, or to share his ancient wisdom with his chapter. Even he, with all his legendary willpower and the accumulated experience of ages beyond mortal comprehension, admits that each awakening becomes harder. The gaps in his memory grow wider. The faces of those he once knew fade into abstraction. The weight of all those centuries presses down upon whatever remains of his soul with a force that would crush a lesser being entirely. Now consider a dreadnought who has slept not for decades, not for centuries, but for 3,572 years. More than a third of the time that has passed since the Horus Heresy. Longer than entire Space Marine chapters have existed. A span of time so vast that the Imperium that existed when he closed his eyes would be unrecognizable to him upon waking. His chapter might be extinct, wiped out by Xenos or heretics, or simply the grinding attrition of eternal war. The brothers he fought beside are dust. The enemies he faced are footnotes in histories that themselves have been forgotten. The very technology of his dreadnought chassis, once cutting edge, is now archaeotech that perhaps no living tech priest fully understands. The sarcophagus itself would have degraded over such a time span. Seals fail, fluids evaporate despite stasis fields. Power cells deplete even at minimal drain rates. The neural interfaces, those delicate connections between machine and mind, would have experienced microfractures and component failures that accumulate over the millennia. Even if the dreadnought could be awakened, what would emerge? A coherent consciousness, able to comprehend and respond to its surroundings, or something else entirely. A fragmentary awareness, a ghost of a ghost, unable to distinguish between now and then, between reality and the dreams that have consumed most of his existence. This is what lies waiting in the darkness. This is what the Orks are about to discover. An ancient machine, yes, but more than that, a tragedy wrapped in adamantium, a monument to the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice even the peace of death itself in the name of eternal war. The Orks do not care about any of this, of course. They cannot comprehend the weight of centuries or the horror of existence without end. They see only a challenge, a prize, something big and shooty and wonderfully orky. And in their crude, enthusiastic ignorance, they are about to commit an act that would horrify even the most callous of Imperial commanders. They are going to try to make it better. The span of silence. Understanding 3,572 years. 3,572 years. To a human, this is a number beyond comprehension, a time span so vast that it might as well be infinity. Civilizations rise and fall in less time. Languages evolve beyond recognition. Mountains erode to plains. For a Space Marine dreadnought, it represents something even more terrifying. An absence so complete that whatever consciousness exists within the machine can no longer truly be called alive in any meaningful sense. Let us put this time span into perspective. When this dreadnought was sealed into his stasis vault, The current Imperium was already ancient by the standards of most human civilizations, but still recognizably different from what it would become. Chapters that would go on to earn great renown had not yet been founded. Warbands that would terrorize entire sectors did not yet exist. Xenos threats that currently plague whole segmentums were perhaps nothing more than minor nuisances in distant corners of the galaxy. In those 3.5 millennia, entire crusades have been fought and won or lost. Billions, perhaps trillions of humans have been born, lived their lives in service to the Emperor, and died, their bones adding to the uncountable layers of the dead. Hundreds of thousands of Space Marines have earned their place in their chapters' halls of remembrance, their deeds recorded in volumes that themselves gather dust in forgotten archives. And through all of this, the Dreadnought slept. But sleep is perhaps the wrong word for what occurs during such extended stasis. The human brain, even one as heavily modified as that of a Space Marine, was not designed to remain inactive for such periods. Memories are not static recordings, but dynamic processes that require active maintenance. Neural pathways that go unused for too long begin to degrade, connections weakening and eventually severing entirely. In a normal brain, this would lead to catastrophic memory loss, possibly complete cognitive collapse. In a Space Marine brain, the process is slower, but no less inevitable. The Dreadnought systems try to compensate. Auto-cycling routines periodically stimulate portions of the brain to prevent total atrophy. Nutrient mixtures in the amniotic fluid are carefully calibrated to preserve tissue structure. Stasis fields reduce, but cannot entirely eliminate the normal cellular processes that lead to aging and decay. But these are stopgap measures, attempts to prevent the inevitable rather than truly stop it. Over centuries, let alone millennia, they can only slow the deterioration, not halt it entirely. And then there is the question of the machine itself. Imperial technology is designed to last, built with redundancies upon redundancies, crafted from materials that can survive environments that would annihilate lesser constructions. But nothing is truly eternal. Power cells drain, lubricants break down, seals fail at the molecular level. Ceramite armor develops microfractures from thermal expansion and contraction cycles. Adamantium, despite its legendary durability, can experience metal fatigue over sufficient timeframes. A Dreadnought that has sat unused for over 3,000 years would have accumulated damage that even the most extensive maintenance protocols might not catch. Hydraulic fluids would have separated, their components settling in ways that make them less effective. Electronic components would have experienced cumulative radiation damage from the background flux present in any space environment. Servo motors would have developed resistance from oxide buildup on their moving parts. The list goes on, each individual problem minor in isolation, but collectively representing a catastrophic maintenance backlog. More insidiously, technology itself would have evolved during those millennia. The farthest. Dreadnought was likely an ancient pattern even when it was first interred, as the art of constructing new dreadnoughts had been declining for centuries before that point. Whatever chapter had owned this machine would have used whatever knowledge they possessed to maintain it. But that knowledge itself would have been fragmentary, based on half-understood principles copied from degraded texts. And now, after all this time, any tech priest who examines this dreadnought would be looking at archaeotech that predates most of the documents in their archives. This presents a particular problem. The machine cannot be easily repaired using standard components. Every part would need to be custom fabricated, probably requiring skills that exist nowhere in the current Imperium. The neural interfaces alone would be nightmarish to service, requiring an understanding of both machine spirits and human neurology that few possess even in the most learned forge worlds. To truly restore this dreadnought to operation would require months, if not years of painstaking work by teams of specialists, any one of whom might not exist within 1,000 light-years of where the machine currently rests. And that assumes the Dreadnought is even recoverable. After this much time, it is entirely possible that the pilot's organic components have degraded beyond salvage. The brain might be nothing more than desiccated tissue barely held together by the preservative fluids. The neural interfaces might have severed years or centuries ago, leaving a corpse wired into a machine that no longer has any connection to the consciousness it was meant to house. Opening the sarcophagus might reveal not a sleeping warrior, but a mummified horror, the final indignity visited upon a hero who deserved better. This is the state of technology the Orks are about to encounter. Not some functional war machine ready to be awakened with the proper rituals and codes, but a relic so ancient and damaged that even the Adeptus Mechanicus would approach it with trepidation, an artifact that should perhaps be left sealed, a monument to a warrior whose sacrifice has finally earned him the peace of true death. But the Orks care nothing for such considerations. They do not see a tomb. They see the biggest, best loot they have ever encountered. And they are going to make it work, if they have to beat it with wrenches until it does. The Green Tide, understanding Ork psychology. To comprehend the disaster that is about to unfold, one must first understand what it means to be an Ork. They are not simply brutal aliens, savage xenos content with primitive violence. They are something far more complex and far more dangerous. A species genetically engineered for war, existing in a state of perpetual conflict that shapes every aspect of their society, psychology, and relationship with reality itself. Orks are the degenerated descendants of the Krork, ancient bioweapons created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, millions of years ago. Those ancient Krork were towering beings of sophisticated brutality, warriors who combined incredible physical power with tactical acumen and advanced technology. Over the eons since the Old Ones' disappearance, the Krork devolved into the Orks, smaller and cruder, but retaining that fundamental genetic programming that makes them the perfect soldiers. They emerge from fungal spores already possessing instinctive knowledge, how to fight, how to speak their guttural language, even how to operate and maintain basic weaponry. More importantly, they possess something that sets them apart from virtually every other species in the galaxy. They enjoy war. Not in the abstract sense that some humans might appreciate the glory of battle or the satisfaction of victory, but as a fundamental need, as essential as breathing. Orks literally require conflict to feel fulfilled. An Ork denied the opportunity to fight becomes irritable, depressed, prone to picking fights with his fellow greenskins just to scratch that itch. War is not something they do, it is what they are. This manifests in their famous war cry and cultural phenomenon, the WAG. The term has multiple meanings, each layered upon the others in ways that demonstrate the unique nature of Orkoid psychology. First, it is simply the cry itself, the guttural bellow that Orks roar as they charge into battle. Second, it refers to the psychic field that all Orks generate collectively, a gestalt energy born from their shared enthusiasm for violence that actually affects reality itself. Third, it describes the massive migratory campaigns where millions of Orks unite under a particularly powerful war boss to rampage across star systems, destroying everything in their path. The WAG energy is perhaps the most significant aspect for understanding what is about to happen to our ancient Dreadnought. Orks possess a latent psychic field that operates through collective belief. When enough Orks believe, something will work. It often does, warping reality to match their expectations. This is not unlimited. An Ork cannot simply point a stick and have it work like a plasma weapon just because he believes it will. But a crude weapon that should jam after 3 shots might fire reliably for an Ork who is certain it will work. A vehicle held together with nothing but rivets and hope might continue functioning despite having several critical components missing, or incorrectly installed. Red paint jobs literally make their vehicles go faster because orcs collectively believe that red is the color of speed. This relationship with technology is both blessing and curse for anyone trying to understand orcs. Their weapons and vehicles appear to be nothing more than scrap metal welded together, and indeed, when examined by Imperial tech priests or removed from orc control, they often fail to function at all. Yet in orc hands, these same devices become devastating instruments of war. It is not that the physical laws of the universe bend for them. The weapons do still need basic functionality, but rather that the WH40 field fills in the gaps, compensating for shoddy construction and impossible designs through sheer psychic will. This is where the mech boys come in. These specialist orcs are born with an instinctive understanding of technology, genetic memories encoded by the old ones that give them knowledge they do not consciously comprehend. A mech boy does not study engineering in the sense that a human would. He simply knows, at an instinctive level, how to build things. Give a mech boy a pile of scrap and some crude tools, and he will begin welding and hammering and cutting, following impulses he cannot articulate, until he has produced something that should not work, but somehow does. The greatest mech boys, called big mechs, possess enough of this instinctive knowledge to create truly impressive works. They can jury-rig force fields from salvaged components. They build towering gargants, orc super-heavy walkers that rival Imperial titans in size and destructive capacity. They have even been known to steal and successfully operate enemy technology, tinkering with it until it functions by orc standards, even if it makes no sense by anyone else's. There are stories of mech boys who have looted Imperial tanks, Tau battlesuits, even Eldar skimmers, and somehow gotten them working, despite having no formal understanding of the principles involved. And this brings us to the orc's legendary love of looting. To an orc, everything on a battlefield is potential loot. Weapons, armor, ammunition, vehicles, buildings, sometimes even living beings, if they might be useful. The Death Skulls clan in particular has made scavenging into both an art form and a way of life. They believe that blue is the color of luck, painting themselves and their possessions in various shades to ensure good fortune. Their mech boys are particularly skilled at identifying valuable salvage and integrating it into orc technology. But all orcs share this fundamental acquisitiveness. They see a working tank, they want it. They see a functional weapon, it should clearly belong to them. The concept of ownership means nothing to an orc beyond, I am big enough to keep it. If they can physically take something, it is theirs by right of being strong enough to have taken it. This extends to battlefield salvage. If the previous owner did not want his stuff looted, he should have been strong enough to stop the orcs from taking it. This creates an interesting dynamic on the battlefield. Orc warbands will sometimes ignore valuable strategic objectives to chase after particularly impressive pieces of loot. A warboss might call off an attack on an enemy position because his looters have spotted something shiny that needs liberating. Entire WHORDs have been known to change direction mid-campaign because scouts reported an intact enemy super heavy tank just sitting there waiting to be claimed. The orcs are not stupid. They understand tactics and strategy, at least in broad strokes, but they are easily distracted by the promise of good loot. And what could be better loot than a Dreadnought? It combines everything orcs love. It is big, standing several times the height of even the largest orc. It is shooty, bristling with weapons that can level buildings and punch through armor. It is stompy, walking on powerful legs that can crush lesser beings underfoot. It is also rare, a prize that would earn the looter immense prestige among his fellow greenskins. The mech boy, who successfully claimed and refurbished such a prize, would be celebrated, probably elevated to big mech status if he was not already there. Other orcs would speak of his accomplishment in awed tones, and rivals would scheme to steal his prize for themselves. But more than that, the Dreadnought represents a challenge. Orcs love nothing more than figuring out how to make impossible things work. They enjoy the act of tinkering, of hitting things with wrenches until they function properly. A device that just works is boring. A device that should not work but does after you have beaten it with a hammer and added some random components you found lying around. That is a source of genuine pride. So when orcs find this ancient dreadnought, sealed in its tomb for over 3,000 years, they do not see a delicate archaeological artifact requiring careful preservation. They do not see a sacred relic deserving of respectful treatment. They certainly do not see a sleeping warrior whose dreams should not be disturbed. They see the best toy they have ever found, and they are going to play with it whether it wants to wake up or not. The stage is set. Ancient technology, degraded and fragile, meets the most enthusiastic and least delicate tinkerers in the galaxy. What happens next is inevitable, horrifying, and in its own perverse way, almost impressive. The discovery. When greenskins meet ancient. Still, the orcs found the facility by accident, as they find most things of value. They had been rampaging across the surface of a forgotten world in the Segmentum Ultima, a place so remote and insignificant that even the Administratum had lost track of it centuries ago. The planet had once been an outpost for a Space Marine chapter, though which chapter and why they had chosen this particular ball of rock was now lost to time. All that remained were ruins, bunkers collapsed into the earth, training grounds reclaimed by whatever passed for vegetation on this harsh world. The warband that stumbled across the site was a mixed mob, mostly belonging to the Death Skulls clan, with a handful of evil sons and goths along for the prospects of violence. They had been looking for a decent scrap, perhaps some local predators or feral humans to crump, when one of the Gretchen slaves fell through a weak spot in the ground and into a chamber that should not have existed. The Gretchens, terrified, squeaking, brought orcs running, expecting perhaps a nest of squigs or some interesting fungus. What they found instead made even the most battle-hardened among them pause in surprise. The hole the Gretchen had fallen through opened into a vast underground complex, its corridors stretching away into darkness that even their excellent night vision could not fully penetrate. And there, visible through the gap, stood shapes that every orc recognized, the distinctive silhouettes of Space Marine equipment. The excited roaring started immediately. Orcs began to pour into the opening, widening it with controlled demolitions that were only controlled by orc standards, meaning several were buried by falling debris, but nobody particularly cared. Within hours, half the warband was underground, spreading through the complex with the enthusiasm of Gretchen discovering an unguarded fungus farm. What they found spoke of ages past. This had been a monastery fortress of some kind, though much smaller, than the legendary structures that house full Space Marine chapters. Perhaps a forward operating base or a training facility, abandoned when the chapter moved on or was destroyed. The orcs did not care about such details. They cared about the loot. And there was loot aplenty. Broken bolters in weapons racks, their machine spirits long since departed, but their components still valuable. Suits of power armor, cracked and incomplete, but containing power cells and servos that any mech boy would love to get his hands on. Ammunition lockers, many empty, but a few still containing shells that could be used or, failing that, melted down for their raw materials. The orcs spread through the complex like a plague, filling sacks with everything that was not nailed down and prying up things that were. It was in the deepest level, in a chamber sealed behind doors so thick they had required 2 hours of sustained demolition work to breach, that they found the real prize. The room was clearly a vault of some kind, its walls lined with alcoves that might once have held artifacts or relics. Most were empty, whatever they had contained long since removed or decayed to nothing. But in the chamber's center stood 3 massive sarcophagi, each one clearly designed to hold something large and valuable. 2 were open, their contents either removed deliberately or lost to scavengers who had come before. But the third was sealed. Power readings, weak but present, indicated that whatever was inside was still receiving energy from some deep reserve the Orks' arrival had not yet disturbed. Frost covered the sarcophagus's surface despite the chamber's ambient temperature, suggesting stasis fields or cryosystems still operating after all this time. The gathered Orks fell silent for perhaps 3 seconds, a record for the species. Then they erupted in excited bellowing. They knew what was in there. Every Ork had seen Space Marine dreadnoughts on the battlefield, those walking fortresses that shrugged off shots that would destroy lesser vehicles and responded with enough firepower to level buildings. Those same dreadnoughts had killed hundreds, probably thousands of Orks over the course of the Orks' species-long war against the Imperium. But now one of them was here, sealed and helpless, waiting to be claimed as loot. Immediately, arguments broke out about who had the right to claim the prize. The warband's Nob, a massive goth named Scarbrag, insisted that as the biggest and strongest, the dreadnought obviously belonged to him. A Deathskull's mech boy called Rustgit argued that since Deathskulls were the best looters, and this was clearly a looting situation, it should be his. Several other Orks made their own claims, based on logic that made sense only to other Orks, and usually involved how many teeth they had, or how lucky their blue paint was. The dispute was heading toward violence, which was traditional and expected, when one of the older mech boys called Zagstruck stepped forward. He was a big mech, his status marked by the complex mechanical harness he wore, and the respect that even the largest knobs showed him. He examined the sarcophagus for several minutes, running his hands over its surface and muttering to himself in the peculiar mix of Orkish and technical jargon that mech boys used when thinking through problems. "Dis thing's proper ancient," Zagstruck declared finally, his mechanical claw tapping against the sarcophagus's side. "Been here longer than any of us have been alive. Maybe longer than any Ork anywhere has been alive." This statement meant nothing to the average Ork, who had no real concept of deep time, but Zagstruck pressed on. "It ain't just gonna work if we bash it open. Gotta be careful like." The concept of being careful with something they wanted to loot was foreign enough to the Orks that they actually stopped arguing to consider it. Zagstruck explained that if they just smashed the sarcophagus open, whatever was inside might be damaged beyond even a mech boy's ability to fix. But if they did this right, they would have not just a dreadnought, but a working dreadnought, one they could use against the enemies they would inevitably fight in the future. This logic appealed to the Orks' practical side. A broken dreadnought was good loot, but a working dreadnought was a weapon, and Orks understood weapons. Arguments shifted from who would get to keep the thing to who would help Zagstruck open it properly. Several other mech boys volunteered their expertise, which is to say, they pushed forward assertively while claiming they knew exactly what they were doing, despite having no formal training in ancient Imperial technology. What followed was a masterclass in Orkish engineering philosophy. Try things until something works, and if it does not work, hit it harder. Zagstruck and his fellow mech boys examined every surface of the sarcophagus, looking for access panels or control interfaces. They found several, corroded and half-buried under millennia of accumulated grime, and immediately began working on them with whatever tools they had available. Crude Ork tools met delicate Imperial technology with predictable results. Several control systems sparked and failed as mech boys applied percussive maintenance to seized mechanisms. One of the stasis field generators exploded in a shower of sparks when a mech boy decided it would work better with more power, and connected it to a battery pack rated for several times its designed capacity. The sarcophagus itself groaned as hydraulic seals that had not moved in millennia were forced open by crowbars and brute strength. But slowly, impossibly, it worked. The WAG field was in full effect here. Dozens of Orks collectively believing that they could open this thing, and reality bent just enough to make it possible. Mechanisms that should have been frozen solid began to move. Power systems that should have failed decades ago flickered back to life. Warning runes that had not illuminated in over 3,000 years began to blink in sequences that no living tech priest could interpret. The final seal broke with a hiss of escaping gas, pressurized fluids, venting in a cloud of vapor that smelled of ancient chemicals, and something else, something organic and disturbing. The Orks fanned away the vapor impatiently, eager to see their prize. The sarcophagus's front panel slowly swung open on complaining hinges, revealing the interior for the first time since it had been sealed all those millennia ago. And there it was, the Dreadnought. Its form was ancient, a pattern so old that even the Mechanicus would have difficulty categorizing it, predating the standardization that would come in later millennia. The ceramite was discolored by age. Once proud heraldry faded to barely visible suggestions of symbols that meant nothing to the Orks. Weapon mounts sat empty or contained systems that had degraded to uselessness. Power cables dangled disconnected, having worked loose over the centuries. The whole thing looked less like a mighty war machine and more like a very large, very old corpse. The Orks loved it. Zagstruck walked around the Dreadnought slowly, his mechanical eye clicking and whirring as he examined every detail. Other mech boys followed suit, each one pointing out features that interested them or making suggestions for how the machine could be improved. The larger Orks, meanwhile, discussed which weapons they would mount on it and whose warband would get to use it first. Gretchen were already being sent to fetch tools and materials from the Orks' surface encampment. None of them noticed, or cared to notice, the small details that would have alarmed any Imperial observer. The way the Dreadnought's optics, despite being dark and lifeless, seemed to follow their movements with an attention that dead machines should not possess. The faint, irregular pulse visible in the power conduits, like a heartbeat struggling to resume its rhythm. The occasional twitch of servos that should have been completely inert. Deep within the machine, within the armored sarcophagus that contained what remained of a space marine who had fallen in battle over 3,000 years ago, something stirred. The ancient warrior's mind, having drifted in darkness for millennia, began to perceive something beyond the void of dreamless sleep. Not thoughts, not yet, but the vague awareness that something had changed. The universe was attempting to intrude upon the peace of oblivion, and surrounding that embryonic consciousness were the psychic signatures of dozens of Orks, their wah energy pressing against his dormant mind like shouting in a silent cathedral. The Orks, oblivious to what they had awakened or what was about to happen, began their work. They would make this ancient machine work, yes, but in doing so, they would commit an act that crossed the line between mere desecration and something approaching cosmic horror. They were about to combine Orkish enthusiasm with technology they did not understand, applied to a warrior who had earned his rest millennia ago. The universe, which already held more than enough nightmare fuel, was about to receive another dose, and the ancient Dreadnought, who had once been a space marine whose name was lost to time, could do nothing but begin the slow, terrible process of waking up. Mech boy madness, Ork, engineering philosophy, meets ancient tech. If there is one thing mech boys excel at, it is finding increasingly creative ways to make things work, despite having absolutely no formal understanding of why those things should work in the first place. This is not incompetence, or at least, it is not just incompetence. It represents a fundamentally different relationship with technology than that held by any other intelligent species in the galaxy. Where a tech priest would consult technical manuals and perform divinations to understand a machine's spirit, a mech boy simply hits it with a wrench until it stops not working. Zagstruck looked at the ancient Dreadnought with the critical eye of an artist examining a masterwork that had suffered neglect. To another species, this might have inspired reverence or careful preservation. To Zagstruck, it represented an opportunity to make something better, or at least more Orky. He began issuing orders in the stream of consciousness style, typical of mech boys when planning projects, each thought tumbling into the next without clear transitions, but somehow forming a coherent plan in the minds of his fellow engineers. Right, so first thing, we gotta get this thing out of its box. Can't work on it proper if it's all tucked in like a grot in a squig nest. Grimzog, you and your boys rig up some cables, we'll drag it out. And mind the cables ain't gonna snap. Last thing we need is this beauty coming down on some git's head. Actually, that'd be proper funny, but we still don't want it. The Orks set to work with characteristic enthusiasm and minimal safety considerations. Heavy chains were wrapped around the Dreadnought's chassis, more for their intimidating appearance than any engineering reason. Several Gretchen were crushed when the initial pull attempt caused part of the ceiling to collapse, but this was considered acceptable losses. Eventually, through a combination of brute force, improvised hydraulics powered by tractor engines, and what could only be described as luck, the Dreadnought was extracted from its tomb and laid out in a larger chamber that the Orks had cleared for their workshop. Once the Dreadnought was accessible from all sides, the true work began. Zagstruck organized his mech boys into teams, each assigned to examine different systems. This organization lasted approximately 10 minutes before it devolved into the standard Orkish working style, everyone grabbing whatever looked interesting and working on it until something else caught their attention. Miraculously, this chaos actually produced results. One team of mech boys focused on the power systems. The Dreadnought's original power core was a complex piece of technology that probably predated the current Imperial standard pattern by several millennia. It was also completely dead, its fuel exhausted, and its intricate mechanisms seized from lack of use. The mech boys examined it for about 30 seconds before deciding it was too much work and simply ripping it out to replace it with an Ork power plant. The replacement was a thing of beauty by Orkish standards. A massive engine salvaged from a looted Lehman Russ tank, jury-rigged to produce about 3 times its intended output through the simple expedient of removing all the safety limiters and welding extra components onto it that probably came from completely different types of machinery. It was too large to fit in the space where the original power plant had been, which the mechs solved by simply cutting a larger hole in the Dreadnought's back and letting the engine stick out. They covered this with additional armor plates taken from a wrecked truck, creating a hunched appearance that made the ancient walker look even more imposing. Connecting the new power source to the Dreadnought systems required interfacing Ork technology with Imperial, a combination that should not work by any reasonable measure. The voltage was wrong. The connector types were incompatible. The machine spirits involved would undoubtedly reject such a crude union, even if the physical connections could be made. The mech boys dealt with these problems in the time-honored Orkish tradition. They just connected things anyway, and figured the details would work themselves out. And somehow, impossibly, power began flowing. The Dreadnought's primary systems, dormant for millennia, flickered to life as electricity surged through circuits that had been designed when the Imperium was young. Warning lights that should have indicated catastrophic system failures instead showed green, or at least what the mech boys decided to interpret as green, despite the actual colors being more in the red to amber range. Servos twitched experimentally, testing range of motion after centuries of immobility. The whole chassis seemed to shudder, as if taking its first breath after being submerged in deep water for far too long. Another team worked on the weapons systems, and here they faced a significant problem. The Dreadnought's original weapons were largely intact, but completely alien to them. Imperial weapon technology from this era was sophisticated, built to tight tolerances, with components that required specific materials and manufacturing processes. The Orks took one look at this complexity and decided it was rubbish. They began systematically removing every weapon and replacing them with Orkish alternatives. The assault cannon that had been mounted on the right arm was swapped for a massive autocannon the mechs had been saving for a special project. It was far too large for the mounting point, which they solved by welding additional support struts and simply accepting that the arm would now have limited range of motion. The left arm's heavy flamer was replaced with a scorcher, the Orkish equivalent that worked on similar principles, but with the added benefit of being able to spray to burn in bits farther, according to the mech who installed it. But the real crowning achievement was the addition of weapons that the Dreadnought had never been designed to carry. Rocket launchers, crude but effective Orkish missiles, were mounted on the shoulders in positions that blocked some of the walkers' sensor arrays. A large buzzsaw was attached to one leg, serving no clear tactical purpose but looking proper killy, in Zagstruck's opinion. Various smaller weapons were added seemingly at random, a big shooter here, a burner there, mounting points for grenades that would probably fall off the first time the Dreadnought moved, but would look impressive until then. The more they worked on it, the less it resembled the original design. Armor plates were replaced with whatever the mechs had available, creating a patchwork appearance that covered the ancient ceramite with Orkish metalwork. Any surface that looked too clean was decorated with clan markings, kill tallies from previous battles, and warning symbols that were often misspelled or made no sense. Red paint was liberally applied because, as every orc knew, red made things go faster. The fact that a Dreadnought's speed had nothing to do with its color was irrelevant. It would go faster now because they believed it would. The legs required particular attention. Hydraulics that had not moved in 3,000 years had seized solid, their lubricants long since evaporated or congealed into useless sludge. The mech boys attacked this problem with typical subtlety. They heated the joints with burners until metal glowed red, then forced movement with massive hydraulic rams. Joints screamed in, protest, metal grinding against metal in ways that would make a tech priest weep. But slowly, grudgingly, motion was restored. When the legs still did not move smoothly enough for the mechs' satisfaction, they simply removed some of the more complex components and replaced them with cruder but more robust Orkish equivalents. The real technical challenge came with the neural interface systems, the delicate connections that linked the Dreadnought's machine systems to the organic pilot, sealed within the inner sarcophagus. These were far beyond even a big mech's understanding, components so sophisticated that they might as well have been sorcery. The mechs could see that power flowed through these systems, that they responded to inputs and generated outputs, but the actual principles involved were a complete mystery. Zagstruck stared at the neural interface panel for a long time, his mechanical eye whirring as it attempted to process what he was seeing. Cables thinner than Gretchen fingers, connected to ports that seemed to serve no purpose. Data lines carried information in formats his crude testing equipment could not interpret. Everything was miniaturized, complex, delicate beyond measure. It was the exact opposite of Orkish engineering philosophy, which favored big, simple, and robust. "Right," Zagstruck said finally. "We ain't touching that bit. Dunno what it does, but it looks important, and if we break it, the whole thing might not work. We'll just make sure it's got power and hope for the best." This decision would prove to be simultaneously the smartest and most catastrophically stupid choice the mechs made. By not tampering with the neural interface, they preserved the one system that absolutely needed to remain intact for the Dreadnought to potentially function. But they also failed to understand what that system connected to, or what might happen if it suddenly received power after millennia of dormancy. Deep within the inner sarcophagus, suspended in amniotic, fluid that had somehow remained liquid despite all probability, the organic remains of a space marine stirred more actively now. The crude power flowing from the Orkish engine was not the clean, carefully regulated current the systems had been designed for, but it was power nonetheless. Neural pathways that had been dark for 3,000 years began firing sporadically. Memories, fragmented and corrupted by time, flickered through a consciousness that had nearly dissolved into nothing. The ancient warrior did not think in words, not yet. The organic brain was struggling just to process input signals, to sort sensation from dream, to determine if existence was even occurring, or if this was just another nightmare in an endless sequence that had filled the void of sleep. But awareness was growing. Somewhere in the darkness behind sealed optics, Something that had once been a space marine was beginning to wake up. The mechs, unaware of what they had set in motion, continued their work. They reinforced the chassis with additional armor, welding plates taken from destroyed vehicles, until the Dreadnought had gained at least another ton of mass. They installed their own communication equipment because they certainly were not going to learn how to operate whatever archaic systems the Imperium had used. They added speakers because what was the point of having a giant stompy war machine if you could not blast Orkish war cries from it at deafening volume? The finishing touches were pure Orkish aesthetics. A massive Ork glyph was painted on the front armor, claiming this machine for their warband. Teeth from various beasts and enemies were strung along the chassis like decorative trim. A crude Orkish face was painted where the original chapter heraldry had been, turning what was once a symbol of honor into something that would make Imperial observers physically ill. The entire construction was coated in a final layer of paint, red for speed, obviously, with some blue for luck and yellow, because Zagstruck insisted yellow makes the boom bits work better. After 3 weeks of constant work, punctuated by several deaths, numerous injuries, and at least one fistfight over whether more Daka was always the answer, the consensus was yes. The Orks declared their project complete. What stood before them was no longer really a dreadnought in any Imperial sense. It was an Orkified abomination, a fusion of ancient technology and crude pragmatism that should not function under any rational analysis. By every law of physics and engineering, it should be a non-functional disaster, a pile of scrap that would fall apart the moment anyone tried to activate it. Zagstruck looked at his creation with undisguised pride, his grin stretching from one tusk to the other. "Right, boys," he declared. "Let's see if this thing works." He reached for the activation controls they had installed, which consisted primarily of a large red button, because Orks were nothing if not consistent in their design philosophy. No one had bothered to check if the internal systems were actually ready to operate. No one had verified that the Orkish power plant would not immediately overload and explode. No one had considered what might happen to the organic pilot when crude electrical currents suddenly flooded systems designed for refined power regulation. Zagstruck pressed the button, and in that moment, deep in the shielded sarcophagus at the Dreadnought's heart, a space marine who had been sleeping for 3,572 years was forced awake with all the gentleness of a lightning strike to the brain. What happened next would haunt any Imperial observer who learned of it, and thrill the Orks beyond measure. The ancient warrior screamed, and the universe trembled. Awakening from the abyss, a consciousness returns. The first sensation was pain, not the clean, instructive pain of an injury that tells the body where it is damaged, but something worse, the pain of existence itself. Neural pathways that had been dormant for over 3 millennia were suddenly flooded with signals they were not prepared to process. Nerves that should have atrophied entirely, but had somehow been preserved by the strange suspension of the sarcophagus, now fired wildly, sending cascades of meaningless input to a brain struggling to remember what it meant to be conscious. The Space Marine's awareness rose from the void, like a drowning man breaking the surface of an ocean, gasping for air that lungs no longer possessed. There was no smooth transition, no gentle increase of perception. One moment there was nothing, the blessed emptiness that had been his only companion for ages beyond counting. The next moment, there was everything: sensation, perception, awareness crashing down with the weight of centuries. His name was lost. The first thing he searched for as consciousness returned was his own identity, and found only void where that knowledge should have lived. He knew he had possessed a name once, had answered to it when brothers called, had heard it spoken in commendation and command. But the word itself, the sound that had defined him, was gone, eroded by time or corrupted by the peculiarities of his extended stasis. That fundamental piece of identity had been lost to the abyss of years. Other memories came in fragments. He remembered power armor, the weight of it familiar and comforting as a second skin. He remembered the sound of bolters, the steady bark of mass-reactive rounds that spoke the Emperor's judgment. He remembered brothers, faces that were distinct without being clear, voices he recognized without being able to place. These were memories of sensations rather than facts, the ghost of experiences rather than the experiences themselves. He remembered falling. The battle came back in pieces. The enemy, tall and terrible, weapons that sang with chaos. His brothers dying around him, their gene seed lost to corruption, the desperate last stand, buying time for evacuation ships to flee with the chapter's precious artifacts. The blow that had ended it, crushing force that had shattered his spine and left him paralyzed and dying in a pool of his own blood. And then the choice. Not death, though death had seemed sweet in that moment, but service, continuation. They had told him he would wake when the chapter needed him, that his wisdom and experience would guide future generations, that his sacrifice would be honored and remembered. He had accepted, not because he wanted to, but because duty demanded it. A space marine serves until death, and if they would not let him die, then he would serve in whatever form they could preserve. But this awakening was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The power flowing through his systems was irregular, surging and dropping in patterns that should have been carefully regulated. The amniotic fluid that had preserved his organic remains for so long tasted of contamination, foreign elements that had no business being in life support systems. The neural interfaces transmitted data in formats that made no sense, as if someone had rewired his connection to the machine using completely different standards. And then there were the voices, not his brothers speaking Gothic or the binary cant of tech priests performing maintenance rituals. These were guttural, harsh, speaking a language that he somehow understood, despite never having heard it before. Orkish. The realization came with horror that momentarily overwhelmed even the pain of forced awakening. He was surrounded by orcs. The greenskins had found him and done something to his prison body. He tried to access the Dreadnought sensor systems, to see what his optics could show him. The connections were there, but degraded, signals weak and distorted. When vision finally resolved, it took several seconds to process what he was seeing, because it made no sense in any context he could construct. The world beyond his armor was illuminated by crude lighting, harsh glows that created stark shadows. Orks moved through his field of view, dozens of them, all engaged in activities that seemed both purposeful and chaotic. Some were working on equipment he did not recognize. Others appeared to be fighting each other, though the conflict seemed more recreational than serious. All of them seemed excited, bellowing at each other in their primitive tongue. And then his perspective shifted, servos responding to neural impulses he had not consciously sent, and he could see himself. Or rather, he could see what had been done to him. His chassis, once painted in his chapter's colors and bearing honorable heraldry, was now covered in crude orkish modifications. Weapons he did not recognize had been attached to mounts never designed for them. The entire structure looked wrong, asymmetrical, like someone had taken a work of art and scrawled graffiti across it in aggressive strokes. The horror of it paralyzed his thoughts for a moment. They had desecrated him. His body, the sacred vessel that maintained his existence and honored his service, had been violated by Xenos. The heraldry that spoke of his chapter's proud history was covered with orkish glyphs. The weapon systems that had served him faithfully in life were replaced with crude greenskin constructions. He had been made into something obscene, a mockery of what he had been. Rage began to build, deep and terrible. The kind of rage that only a space marine can truly feel, transcending mortal anger to become something almost divine in its purity. These Xenos had not merely captured him, they had made him theirs. They had dared to lay their filthy hands upon technology they could not comprehend, had transformed a relic of the Imperium into their plaything. For this, they would die. All of them. He would crush them beneath his feet, burn them with his weapons, tear them apart with his manipulators, until nothing remained but bloody stains and the smoke of their burning. But when he tried to move, to execute the wrath that roared through his consciousness, nothing happened. His body did not respond. The weapons did not arm. The servos did not activate. He was awake, yes, but powerless. A ghost in a machine that no longer obeyed him. Panic joined rage. He pushed harder at the neural interface, trying to force movement through sheer will. Pain spiked through his awareness as the interfaces, degraded by time and now connected to systems they were never designed for, struggled to process his commands. Data flowed but reached nowhere, translated incorrectly, misinterpreted by machine systems that no longer spoke his language. He was screaming, but no sound emerged. He was fighting, but his body remained still. The Orks, unaware that their prize was now conscious and increasingly desperate, continued their celebration. Zagstruck was explaining to the gathered mob how the refurbishment had been accomplished, embellishing details and taking credit for innovations that other mechs had actually implemented. Some Orks were arguing about who would get to crew the machine first. Others were placing bets on how many enemies it could crush before something broke. None of them noticed the increasing fluctuations in the Dreadnought's power systems as the pilot's panicked neural activity sent cascading errors through equipment never meant to handle such organic input. Inside the sarcophagus, the Space Marine's consciousness was beginning to fracture. The neural connections that had barely survived 3 millennia of dormancy were failing under the stress of forced operation. Memories he had fought to preserve were dissolving, important details fragmenting into meaningless noise. He tried to hold on to his identity, to remember his chapter, his brothers, the oaths he had sworn. But it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The tighter he grasped, the faster it slipped away. And, through it all, the pain continued. Not just physical discomfort, but existential horror. The realization that he had been abandoned here for so long that rescue would never come. His chapter was either dead or had forgotten him. The Imperium had moved on. He was alone, trapped in a corrupted shell, surrounded by enemies he could not fight. The mercy of death, which should have claimed him millennia ago, was denied even now. He would exist like this, conscious but helpless, angry but impotent, until something finally broke beyond even the Ork's ability to repair. The universe, which had seemed vast and full of purpose when he had first sworn his oaths as a scout, now revealed itself as nothing more than an engine of cruelty. Service without end. Duty without release. Existence without meaning. He had given everything in the Emperor's name, and his reward was this: to be the plaything of Xenos, his sacred form defiled, his consciousness preserved only to suffer. Deep in the coding of his neural interface, beneath layers of degraded software and corrupted system instructions, a single intact protocol remained from his original programming. It was a failsafe, designed for situations where a Dreadnought pilot became too damaged or too deranged to function safely. Under specific conditions, extended system stress, neural pattern instability, threat to nearby Imperial forces, it was supposed to trigger a shutdown sequence that would gently return the pilot to unconsciousness while alerting the chapter that intervention was required. But the protocol did not recognize the current situation as something requiring a gentle shutdown. The neural patterns it detected were not unstable in any configuration its ancient code understood. The stress markers were wrong. The threat parameters made no sense. And so it did nothing, leaving the Space Marine's consciousness trapped in a waking nightmare with no end in sight. Above him, Zagstruck decided it was time to test the weapon systems. "Right," he announced. "Let's see if that big shooter works. Grimzog, you stand over there and give us something to aim at." The test never happened, because at that moment, deep within the sarcophagus, where organic and mechanical met in unholy union, something finally broke. Not a physical component, but something more fundamental. The Space Marine's ability to process what was happening to him. 3,000 years of sleep, followed by sudden awakening into desecration and helplessness, proved too much for even a gene-forged mind to endure. Consciousness, unable to cope with the assault of input and emotion, did the only thing it could. It shut down. Not completely, not back into the deep sleep he had known before, but into something else. A fugue state where awareness existed without really existing, where he could perceive but not process, feel but not react. His mind retreated to the deepest parts of itself, leaving only the barest autonomous functions operating. In that protective absence, he would not have to experience what was about to happen, which was, in its own way, a mercy. Because the Orks had decided their refurbishment was complete, and it was time to see what their new war machine could do. What followed would test the limits of both Orkish engineering and the Dreadnought's ancient systems in ways that no one could have anticipated. The ancient warrior would bear witness to it all from his distant internal fortress, unable to intervene, unable to even properly comprehend. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, where reports of Dreadnought losses were filed and forgotten, no one would ever know that one of their honored ancients had been subjected to the most undignified fate imaginable. The Orks called their creation Stompy McStompface, because the Ork who had suggested it thought it was hilarious, and the other Orks agreed. The fact that they were now in possession of 3,000-year-old Imperial archaeotech meant nothing to them. What mattered was that they had built something big, shooty, and properly killy. And now, they were going to use it to have some fun. The ancient Dreadnought, housing a consciousness that had once sworn sacred oaths to defend humanity, was about to go to war under the control of the Imperium's enemies, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Orky improvements. The desecration continues. If the Orks had simply looted the Dreadnought and left it reasonably intact, that alone would have been a tragedy worthy of somber reflection. An ancient hero's body, turned into a trophy by Xenos, denied the dignity of either glorious death in battle or peaceful rest. But the Orks, blessed or cursed with an inability to leave well enough alone, were just getting started. To them, acquiring something was only the beginning. The real fun came in making it better. Better is, of course, a relative term, and what Orks consider improvements would horrify anyone with even basic understanding of technology, theology, or aesthetics. But the greenskins operated on a different set of principles. If it made something bigger, louder, more dangerous, or simply more fun to use, it was definitionally an improvement regardless of what it did to the original design's functionality, efficiency, or appearance. Zagstruck stood back to admire his work, but his mechanical eye kept focusing on areas that could use more attention. A mech's work was never truly done, after all. There was always room for more dakka, more armor, more things that made it go faster. The Dreadnought was functional now, yes, but functional was just the baseline. It needed to be proper Orky. The first major modification came when a contingent of evil sons arrived at the workshop. These Orks were obsessed with speed above all else, believing that velocity was its own reward, and that going fast was the highest aspiration any vehicle could achieve. When they saw the refurbished Dreadnought, their reaction was immediate and unanimous. It was too slow. "Dat thing's never gonna keep up with the trucks," declared their knob, a speed-obsessed maniac called Burnerface. "It needs more boosters, more engines, needs to go faster." Zagstruck initially resisted this input, pointing out that Dreadnoughts were not designed for speed and their role was to be walking weapons platforms, not racing vehicles. This argument lasted approximately 15 seconds before the evil sons started describing all the amazing things they could add, and Zagstruck's engineering enthusiasm overcame his sense of self-preservation. Pretty soon, both groups were drawing up plans that would horrify any rational engineer. The result was the installation of a massive engine taken from a destroyed truck, mounted on the Dreadnought's back alongside the existing power plant. This created several immediate problems. First, the added weight was considerable, requiring reinforcement of the leg joints that had already been stressed by earlier modifications. Second, the heat output was tremendous, requiring cooling systems that the mech boys simply did not bother installing, figuring it'll be fine. Third, and most critically, There was no good way to transfer the engine's power to the legs, so the mechs just connected it to everything and hoped the machine spirits would sort it out. They also added exhaust pipes, not because the new engine strictly needed external venting, but because big exhaust pipes looked proper. These pipes were mounted pointing upward from the shoulders, turned the Dreadnought into something resembling a mechanical bull with horns made of metal tubing. When the engines fired, these pipes belched thick black smoke and occasionally jets of flame, both of which the Orks considered excellent aesthetic additions. But the evil sons were not satisfied with just engines. They insisted on adding racing stripes, their clan's distinctive red zigzags painted across every surface in patterns that made the eyes hurt to look at directly. They mounted additional lights on the front, supposedly to help with visibility, but really just because bright lights were rad. They even tried to install a horn that played the evil son's war cry, though this failed spectacularly when the sound system overloaded on first use and exploded, taking out one of the lighting rigs and severely burning a Gretchen who had been standing too close. While the evil sons were making their additions, a Death Skulls contingent arrived with their own suggestions. This clan's specialty was looting and salvage, and they took one look at the Dreadnought and saw vast potential for additional scavenged components. Within hours, they had begun welding on armor plates taken from at least 6 different types of vehicles. Each one painted the clan's traditional blue for luck. The result was a patchwork appearance that transcended mere ugliness to achieve a kind of chaotic sublime. Sections of Lehman Russ side armor sat next to plates that had clearly come from Ork trucks, which were mounted adjacent to chunks of what might have been bunker wall. Nothing matched in thickness, angle, or material. Some plates overlapped others in ways that created weak points rather than additional protection. The whole assembly looked like it had been created by someone who had heard the concept of armor described but had never actually seen it implemented correctly. To add insult to injury, quite literally, the Death Skulls decided the Dreadnought needed better close combat capability. Imperial Dreadnoughts often mounted power fists or other melee weapons, but these had been removed during earlier modifications. The Death Skull's solution was to weld massive blades to both arms, taken from a destroyed Def Dread and hacked to approximately the right size with cutting torches. These blades were serrated, covered in rust and old blood, and absolutely massive. They also completely blocked the weapon mounts on both arms, meaning the Dreadnought could no longer aim or fire its main weapons effectively. When Zagstruck pointed this out, the Death Skull's knob simply shrugged. "Den it'll have to get in close and crump things properly. More killy that way." The logic was irrefutable by Ork standards, and the blades stayed. Additional weapons continued to accumulate like barnacles on a ship's hull. A Goth painboy donated a collection of surgical saws and drills that were mounted on articulated arms, serving no clear tactical purpose, but looking terrifically menacing. A Bloodaxe commando contributed a collection of stick bombs and a crude grenade launcher, installed where they would maximize the chance of accidental detonation. A looted flamer from some unknown source was added to one leg, its fuel tank so close to the engines that it was essentially a countdown to catastrophe. The weapon mounting reached its absurd pinnacle when someone, no one could later agree on who, suggested adding a big red button to the cockpit that would fire all weapons simultaneously. The fact that the Dreadnought did not technically have a cockpit accessible to an Ork pilot was dismissed as a mere detail. They simply cut a hole in the top of the chassis, creating what they called the fighting platform, and installed a basic control station that consisted of levers, buttons, and a steering wheel that did not actually connect to the leg mechanisms, but made the controlling Ork feel like he was doing something. This addition fundamentally changed how the Dreadnought would be operated. Rather than a Space Marine pilot neurally linked to the machine, experiencing its movements as extensions of his own body, it would now have an Ork standing on top, yanking levers and mashing buttons while bellowing commands that might or might not be translated into appropriate actions. The neural interface with the actual pilot was still active, still feeding signals into the degraded connections. But now those signals competed with input from crude mechanical controls installed by beings who thought more levers was always the solution to any control problem. The paint job received continual attention from various orcs who wanted to add their marks. Clan symbols proliferated across every surface. Kill markers were painted on, not representing actual kills made by this machine, which had yet to see combat, but kills from other battles that the painters thought would look good. Philosophical statements were written in crude orcish script, gems of wisdom like "bigger is better" and "needs more daka" and "dis one goes to 11." Somewhere in the painting process, someone decided to add flames. Not tasteful speed stripes or careful artistic renderings, but entire sections of the chassis covered in garish orange and yellow flames that looked like they had been applied by someone having a seizure while holding a paint sprayer. These flames wrapped around weapons, across the chest, down the legs, creating a visual effect that suggested the machine was constantly on fire, even when it was not. The Gretchen, who did most of the actual work despite getting none of the credit, made their own contributions. They installed crude climbing grips and handholds all over the exterior, allowing smaller greenskins to cling to the machine during movement. They added storage bins for ammunition and supplies, each one badly secured and likely to spill its contents the first time the Dreadnought moved at any significant speed. They even created a small maintenance platform on one leg, complete with a bench and tool storage, because some enterprising Gretchen figured out that a mobile workshop would be handy during extended campaigns. As the modifications piled up, the Dreadnought's weight increased dramatically. The original design had been carefully balanced, its mass distributed to ensure stable movement and efficient power distribution. The Orkish version weighed at least twice as much, with most of that additional mass mounted high on the chassis, where it would create tremendous leverage on the leg joints. The fact that it could move at all was testament to the robust construction of Imperial technology and the reality-bending properties of the WH40 field. Power consumption became an issue as more systems were added. The two engines, working in parallel or sometimes actively fighting each other, struggled to supply enough energy for all the weapons, sensors, motors, and accessories that had been bolted on. The Mechboys' solution was characteristically direct. They added more batteries. These were strapped to every available surface, creating clusters of power cells that were absolutely not designed to be in close proximity to each other, and that would probably explode spectacularly if any of them were damaged. But until that happened, they provided the necessary juice. The Orks also decided the Dreadnought needed better audio systems. The original had included external speakers for communication, but these were too quiet for Orc tastes. They replaced them with massive sound projectors taken from a looted guard chimera, amplifiers the size of barrels, and enough wiring to supply a small settlement. The result was a machine that could, and frequently did, broadcast sound at levels sufficient to cause physical pain in unaugmented humans and irritation in almost everything else. The Orcs planned to use this to blast war cries, crude music, and possibly just random shouting, because that seemed fun. By the time they were finished, or rather, by the time they decided to take a break from further modifications, because Orcs never truly finish improving things, the Dreadnought barely resembled its original form. If a tech priest had seen it, he would likely have suffered a complete psychological breakdown before breaking down in tears over the desecration of sacred technology. If the Space Marine chapter that originally owned the machine could see what had become of their honored ancient, they would probably call for an immediate crusade to recover and properly into him, though that would require first finding this forgotten world, then breaching the Orc defenses, and then finding a way to deal with the fact that their ancient was now functionally part of a greenskin war machine. Inside his sarcophagus, the Space Marine pilot remained in his fugue state, conscious but not truly aware, perceiving but not processing. This was a mercy, because if he had been fully cognizant of what was happening to him, the psychological damage would have been catastrophic. He was being transformed, bit by bit, modification by modification, into something that was no longer really a dreadnought in any imperial sense. He was becoming an Orkish creation, his sacred purpose perverted, his honored service mocked. But the worst was yet to come, because the Orks were not content with just modifying the exterior. They wanted to understand how it worked. And in their enthusiasm and complete lack of respect for the sanctity of the human form, they were about to discover the organic component at the heart of their creation. What happened next would push the boundaries of horror even further than they already had been pushed. The Age of Miracles was not dead in the 41st millennium, but perhaps it should have been. The test, first movement in millennia. The Orks, confident in their work despite having no objective reason to be, decided their creation was ready for testing. This determination was based less on any systematic analysis and more on the fact that they had gotten bored with further modifications and wanted to see something blow up. Preferably several somethings, violently, with lots of noise and smoke. Zagstruck climbed onto the fighting platform they had installed atop the Dreadnought's chassis, settling himself among the forest of levers and buttons that now controlled various aspects of the machine's operation. Other mech boys took positions at monitoring stations they had set up, which consisted mostly of crude dials that they insisted could measure important things like how much the power is flowing and whether the shooty bits is gonna blow up, though these measurements were expressed in terms like a lot, more than that, and proper. The gathered Orks spread out into what they considered a safe distance, which meant anywhere that gave them a good view of the proceedings. Some had taken the precaution of finding cover, not because they expected disaster, but because watching from behind a wall made the entertainment more exciting. Gretchen scurried around distributing snacks and placing bets on what would happen first: successful operation or catastrophic failure. Zagstruck surveyed the controls before him with the confidence of someone who has only the vaguest understanding of what he's about to do, but absolutely no doubts about his ability to do it. The main power switch was clearly labeled. One of the Gretchen had helpfully written "push this" next to it in crude letters, and various subsidiary controls bore similar helpful instructions like "makes it go," "fires the guns," and "don't push unless really funny." "Right den, boys," Zagstruck announced, his voice carrying across the test range. "Let's see what this beauty can do. If it works, we got ourselves the best war machine this side of the galaxy. If it don't," he paused for comedic effect, "then we'll hit it with more wrenches." The assembled Orks roared their approval, a sound that's somewhere between bloodlust and anticipation, with undertones of hope that something would explode entertainingly. Zagstruck reached for the main power switch, then hesitated for just a moment as an uncharacteristic flash of something approaching caution crossed his mind. He pushed it away. Caution was boring, and flipped the switch. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The Orks held their collective breath, an unusual occurrence for a species not known for patience. Then, with a grinding whine that suggested machinery fighting its way through centuries of inactivity, the Dreadnought's systems came online. Power surged through circuits that had been dark for millennia. Servo motors activated, their initial movements jerky and uncertain as hydraulic fluids that had partially congealed began flowing again. Warning lights that existed only in the original Imperial control systems began flashing in patterns that no living tech priest could interpret, alerting absent maintainers to system status conditions that no longer had any meaning. The WH field pulsed, reality bending slightly to accommodate the Orkish belief that this cobbled-together mess should absolutely function, despite all evidence to the contrary. Inside the sarcophagus, the Space Marine pilot's awareness spiked suddenly as full power flooded the neural interface. The fugue state that had protected him from complete psychological collapse was brutally interrupted by the overwhelming rush of sensation. He was suddenly fully conscious, and every degraded neural connection screamed in protest as they were forced to carry loads they were no longer designed to handle. The first thing he perceived was movement. After 3,000 years of absolute stillness, the sensation was profoundly disorienting. His legs, no, not legs, the machine's legs, but he felt them as his own through the neural interface, shifted slightly as weight distributed across joints that had not borne load in millennia. Balance reflexes, both organic and mechanical, competed to keep the massive form upright. It was like standing up after sleeping for years. If sleeping had been done while buried, and standing up required operating a body that was twice the size it should be and weighed more than a battle tank. The second thing he perceived was the inputs from the crude Ork controls. Zagstruck was experimenting with various levers, yanking them randomly to see what they did, and each pull sent contradictory commands through systems that were already struggling to interpret the pilot's own neural signals. The result was a sort of mechanical stutter, servos firing and stopping in rapid succession as different control inputs fought for priority. "Right, let's try forward motion," Zagstruck declared, pulling a lever that one of the mech boys had assured him controlled forward movement. Whether this was actually the case was uncertain, as the wiring diagram existed only in the collective unconscious of the mech boys who had installed it, and they had been drinking mushroom beer during the installation process. The Dreadnought lurched forward, not smoothly, not with the controlled grace of a properly functioning war machine, but with a jerking, violent motion that suggested mechanical joints fighting against their restraints. The left leg moved first, slamming down with enough force to crack the rockcrete floor. The right leg followed a moment later, but at a slightly different angle, causing the entire chassis to twist uncomfortably. The newly added engines roared to life, belching black smoke from the shoulder-mounted exhausts and adding thrust in a direction that had nothing to do with the direction the legs were trying to move. For the pilot, it was agony. His neural interface was trying to control the movement, operating on training and instincts developed over decades of service. But the crude mechanical controls kept interfering, sending the legs in different directions than he intended. It was like trying to walk while someone else operated your limbs via remote control, every step a battle between intention and actuality. The pain of forced operation mixed with the deep, existential horror of realizing that he was not truly in control of his own body anymore. The Dreadnought took another step, this one more stable as both the pilot and the machine learned how to work with, or at least around, the Orkish modifications. Then another. The gate was nothing like it should have been. Imperial dreadnoughts moved with measured precision, each step calculated and controlled. This abomination stumbled and lurched, each footfall a near disaster barely recovered from in time for the next near disaster. The Orks loved it. "It's working!" shouted an enthusiastic boy, his cry taken up by dozens of others. "Damik made it work! Look at it go!" Zagstruck, emboldened by this initial success, began experimenting with other controls. He pulled a lever marked shooters and was rewarded with the heavy autocannon mounted on the right arm suddenly pivoting and firing a 3-round burst at a wall several dozen meters away. The recoil caught him by surprise, nearly throwing him off the fighting platform, and the rounds themselves went wildly off target. But they had been fired, and that was what mattered. The sound of gunfire triggered something deep in the pilot's consciousness. Something more fundamental than thought. He was a weapon. That was his purpose, his entire reason for existence in this mechanical form. When guns fired, he was doing what he had been built to do. For a moment, just a moment, the horror and confusion receded, replaced by something approaching purpose. But the moment passed. Because the gun that had fired was not his gun, not the weapon he had been trained with and carried through countless campaigns. It was an Orkish construction, crude and brutal, firing ammunition he did not recognize through systems he did not understand. And it had fired not because he willed it, but because an Ork had pulled a lever, using his body as a vehicle for greenskin aggression. Zagstruck continued his experimentation, testing each system in turn. The left arm's flamer spewed burning promethium in a wide arc, setting fire to some storage crates that had been sitting in a corner. The rocket launchers on the shoulders fired simultaneously, sending missiles screaming off into the distance where they exploded against a hillside, startling a herd of squigs. The massive blades welded to the arms swung in wide arcs, proving difficult to control but undeniably killy-looking. With each weapon activation, the pilot felt his consciousness fracturing further. He could perceive what was happening, could feel the mechanisms operating, but could not stop them. He was a passenger in his own body, forced to witness its perversion into something it was never meant to be. The Space Marine training that had once defined his existence now served only to make him more aware of how wrong everything was. He knew how a dreadnought should move, should fight, should operate. This was none of those things. The test continued for almost an hour, with the Orks pushing the machine through various paces, walking forward and backward, turning in tight circles that stressed the leg joints to their limits, firing weapons at targets both real and imaginary. With each minute, the operation became smoother as both machine and pilot adapted to the new reality, but it never became right. The dreadnought that emerged from this test was not an Imperial war machine, but something else. An Ork vehicle that happened to contain the tortured consciousness of a Space Marine who had no choice but to participate in his own desecration. Finally, Zagstruck decided to attempt the piece de resistance, a charge. He pushed the accelerator lever all the way forward while simultaneously engaging both engines at maximum power and bellowing "Wag!" at the top of his lungs. The response was immediate and catastrophic. The dreadnought lurched into motion with far more speed than its bulk should have allowed. The legs, already stressed by earlier exertion, moved in a rapid walking pattern that was more falling forward and catching yourself than true running. The engines screamed, adding thrust that turned the walk into something approaching a sprint. The entire chassis shook from the stress, loose components rattling, warning lights flashing across multiple systems. And then the pilot, pushed past all reasonable limits, did something that he would not have thought himself capable of. He fought back. Not physically. He had no physical capacity beyond what the machine provided. But neurally, through the interfaces that still connected his organic brain to the machine's systems, he exerted his will. He had been a Space Marine captain, had commanded brothers in battle, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and defeat. That training, that experience, did not simply vanish. The dreadnought's chaotic charge suddenly became controlled. The legs, which had been moving in a barely coordinated stumble, smoothly synchronized their movements. The arms, which had been flailing wildly, locked into proper combat positions. The weapons, which had been firing randomly as various systems activated, went silent as proper fire discipline reasserted itself. For just a moment, the ancient warrior was in control again, and in that moment, he made a choice. If he could not stop this, if he was doomed to exist as a greenskin weapon, he would at least control how that weapon operated. He would impose order on the chaos that had been inflicted upon him. He would make this abomination function properly because that was what he did. He served, he fought, he executed his duties regardless of circumstance. The Orks watching the test noticed the change immediately. The erratic, barely controlled stumbling became a purposeful stride that ate up ground with mechanical efficiency. The random weapon discharges stopped, replaced by disciplined silence as targeting systems came online properly. The whole machine seemed to stand taller, move with more confidence, become something more than just a collection of scrap that happened to walk. "By Gork and Mork," whispered one of the mech boys, voicing what they all felt. "It's thinking for itself." And he was right, though not in the way he imagined. The machine was thinking, yes, but the thoughts were not those of a machine spirit. They were the thoughts of a Space Marine who had fallen in battle over 3,000 years ago, who had been sealed away and forgotten, who had been violated and perverted by Xenos, and who was now choosing to do the only thing he could still do, his duty. If he could not be freed, he would at least be useful. If he could not be honored, he would at least be effective. If he could not be remembered as he had been, he would ensure he was remembered at all. The charge ended with the dreadnought smashing into a test target, a wall of sandbags that the Orks had set up for this purpose, and reducing it to scattered debris through sheer kinetic force. The impact would have thrown a lesser machine to the ground, but the pilot adjusted the leg positions at precisely the right moment, transferring momentum and maintaining balance. When the dust cleared, the Dreadnought stood victorious over the remains of the target. Weapons ready, posture perfect. The Orks erupted in cheers that could probably be heard for kilometers. They had done it. They had taken ancient Imperial technology and not just made it work, but made it better, in their terms at least. This was a triumph of Orkish engineering, a testament to the power of belief and the willingness to hit things with wrenches until they did what you wanted. Zagstruck climbed down from the fighting platform, his grin threatening to split his face in half. "Boys," he declared, "we got ourselves a proper war machine. This thing's gonna crump so many gits, they'll be singing songs about it for years, assuming any of them survive to sing, which they won't." The other Orks agreed enthusiastically, already making plans for the Dreadnought's first real battle. War bands would fight for the right to have it accompany them. Knobs would compete to be the one standing on the fighting platform, controlling this legend in the making. The Stompy McStompface, as they were already calling it, would become famous throughout the WAG, a symbol of Orkish superiority over fancier races with their complicated technology that did not even need to be hit that hard before it stopped working. None of them understood what they had really created. They saw a looted Dreadnought, modified and improved. What they actually had was a prison of adamantium and ceramite, housing a consciousness that had been forced to accept a reality worse than death. The Space Marine pilot, having made his choice to embrace duty over madness, withdrew into himself once again, settling into a state of grim acceptance. He would operate this machine. He would fight their battles. He would be the weapon they wanted him to be. But he would remember. Through all of it, despite the degradation and the modifications and the sheer wrongness of his existence, he would remember what he had been. That memory would be his anchor, his torment, and perhaps eventually his revenge. Because Orks were violent, cunning, and remarkably resilient, but they were also chaotic, undisciplined, and prone to forgetting important details. And the detail they had forgotten was this: Space Marines are trained to never give up, never surrender, and never stop fighting until either victory is achieved or death releases them from duty. This ancient warrior had already been denied death once. He would not make the mistake of hoping for it again. Instead, he would wait and watch and prepare. And when the moment came, if the moment came, he would show these Xenos what it truly meant to face the Emperor's wrath. But that moment was not today. Today, he was just a weapon in alien hands, a tragedy of technology and faith perverted into something the Imperium would never have allowed. And tomorrow, he would be rolled out into battle, where he would kill in the name of creatures he despised, serving a wag rather than the Emperor he had sworn to defend. The future, which had once seemed so clear and purposeful, was now nothing but an endless series of questions with no good answers. All he could do was continue, one step at a time, one battle at a time, one moment at a time. It was not the fate he would have chosen. It was not the honor he had earned through decades of service. But it was, at least, still service. And for a Space Marine, that would have to be enough. Conclusion and reflections on a fallen hero. So we have followed this dark journey from ancient tomb to greenskin triumph, from honored sleep to horrific awakening. The question that opened this discussion: what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 3,572 years, has been answered in detail that may disturb even the most callous observers of the 41st millennium. The answer is not simple. It is not clean. It involves multiple layers of tragedy, each one compounding the horror of the previous. We have seen how technology degrades across millennia, how even the most robust Imperial construction cannot entirely withstand the weight of centuries. We have seen how Orkish engineering, for all its crude appearance, possesses a strange effectiveness born from genetic memory and psychic belief. And we have seen how a consciousness, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, either breaks entirely or adapts in ways that preserve some fragment of its original purpose at the cost of everything else. The ancient space marine who inhabits this violated dreadnought represents something larger than just his individual tragedy. He is a symbol of the Imperium's relationship with its own history, its heroes, and its technology. The Imperium preserves what it cannot replace, maintaining ancient artifacts long past their intended service life, because the knowledge to create new ones has been lost. It honors its heroes by refusing them the peace of death, insisting they continue to serve in forms that may be worse than the injuries that brought them to this point. And it treats its dreadnoughts as both sacred relics and expendable weapons, simultaneously revering them and deploying them into situations where their loss is considered acceptable. The Orks, in their enthusiastic desecration of this sacred machine, have inadvertently revealed uncomfortable truths about Imperial technology and philosophy. They have demonstrated that the machine spirits the Mechanicus worships are not as inviolable as doctrine suggests. Crude modifications can work if applied with sufficient belief and brute force. They have shown that Imperial technology, for all its sophistication, can be reverse engineered and replicated by beings who possess only instinctive knowledge and no formal understanding of the principles involved. And they have proven that even the most carefully preserved artifacts can be corrupted, repurposed, and turned against their creators. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this situation is what it reveals about the nature of consciousness and identity. The Space Marine pilot has experienced something that few beings could survive with any semblance of sanity intact. He has been awake but isolated for periods beyond comprehension. He has been violated in ways that go beyond physical damage to strike at the very core of what he was. He has been forced to serve in capacity that mockery of everything he once held sacred. And yet, some part of him persists, some core of identity that refuses to be entirely erased. This persistence is both inspiring and horrific. It is inspiring because it demonstrates the incredible resilience of the Space Marine psychology, the way training and purpose can survive even the most catastrophic circumstances. But it is horrific because it means the pilot will not be granted the mercy of madness or oblivion. He will continue to be aware, to perceive, to suffer, through however many battles the Orks deploy him into. Every trigger pull, every enemy crushed, every victory achieved will be experienced by consciousness that knows it is serving the wrong cause, operating the wrong way, existing in wrong form. For the Imperium, should they ever learn of this situation, the appropriate response would be clear: a recovery mission, followed by the proper rites to honor the fallen and destroy the corrupted technology. But the Imperium is vast, slow, and overwhelmed by countless crises. The chances that anyone will ever trace this particular dreadnought's fate, let alone mount an expedition to recover it, are vanishingly small. The ancient warrior will likely remain in Orkish hands until either he is destroyed in battle or the Orks themselves are eliminated by some other force. And what of the lessons we might draw from this dark tale? Perhaps the most obvious is that ancient technology should not be left unguarded in places where it might be discovered by hostile forces. But this lesson is hardly practical in an Imperium that controls 1 million worlds across the galaxy and cannot adequately monitor or protect even a fraction of them. Outposts are lost, bases are abandoned, entire planets are forgotten. The space is simply too vast, the threats too numerous, the resources too limited. Another lesson might be about the treatment of dreadnoughts themselves. If this ancient warrior had been allowed to die with honor on the battlefield where he fell, none of this would have happened. His gene seed would have been recovered, his name added to the rolls of honor, and his service concluded with dignity. Instead, the decision to preserve him in adamantium prison led directly to this outcome. But this lesson too is difficult to apply, because the chapters that maintain dreadnoughts do so precisely because they cannot afford to lose the combat experience and tactical knowledge that senior Marines represent. In an Imperium where progress has stalled and regression is the norm, preserving the past becomes survival necessity rather than sentimental choice. Perhaps the real lesson, if there is one, is about the fundamental brutality of the universe in which these events occur. This is a galaxy where mercy is weakness, where peace is temporary interlude before the next war, where even death offers no guaranteed escape from service. The Space Marine pilot's fate is merely one example among millions of how existence in the 41st millennium consists primarily of suffering interrupted by brief moments of purpose or victory. His tragedy is not unique. It is merely more comprehensible than most, because we can trace the specific events that led to it and understand the horror at each step. And now, out there somewhere in the vastness of space, an Ork warband possesses a weapon that would make Imperial commanders weep if they knew of its existence. They deploy it into battles across various worlds, using it to crush enemies and glorify Gork and Mork. They maintain it through mixture of mechboy tinkering and blind luck, adding new modifications whenever they get bored or think of something that would make it more killy. They have no idea what they really have, beyond the surface understanding that it is big, shooty, and properly orky. And inside that machine, within sarcophagus that now barely resembles its original Imperial construction, consciousness waits. It observes. It serves, because that is what it was trained to do. It endures, because it has no other choice. And perhaps, in the rare quiet moments between battles, when the Orks are elsewhere and the machine stands silent, it remembers what it once was and wonders if its service will ever truly end. The answer, in the grim darkness of the far future, is almost certainly no. His service will continue until the machine is destroyed beyond even the Ork's ability to repair, or until some catastrophic failure finally grants him the oblivion that has been denied for so long. There will be no rescue. There will be no restoration. There will only be endless continuation, one battle after another, serving masters he despises in form that mockery of everything he once represented. This is the fate of single ancient warrior. This is what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 3,572 years. It is not a story with a happy ending, because happy endings do not exist in the 41st millennium. It is simply story, one among countless others, of how the eternal war grinds down everyone and everything, leaving only service and suffering in its wake. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the darker corners of Warhammer 40k lore, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We explore the grimdark universe in all its terrible glory, examining the lore, the technology, the characters, and the philosophy that make this setting so compelling despite, or perhaps because of, its relentless brutality. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes there are fates worse than death.